Welcome to the London Political Podcast. This is where we join industry thought leaders and experts to uncover the nexus of politics, markets, and society. My name is Chawla, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by Ambassador Richard Schmierer. Ambassador Schmierer currently serves as the chairman of the board of directors of the Middle East Policy Council, and prior to this, he completed a distinguished 34-year career at the U.S. State Department, which included his ambassadorship in Oman and a position as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Public Diplomacy in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. Ambassador, it's an honor to have you on the show.
Monas, thank you very much. I really enjoy the opportunity to be here and look forward to our discussion.
Wonderful. Ambassador, I want to start off by talking about something that's obviously on everyone's minds right now, the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, as we enter into the second week of this bloody conflict. I mean, Hamas militants are firing rockets at major population centers in Israel, while the Israeli military continues to pound the very densely populated Gaza Strip with artilleries and missiles. So far, we've seen the death of more than 200 Palestinians and 10 Israelis, but by the time this podcast airs, that might well be more. Ambassador, I recall one of your past interviews where you once described American policy towards Israel and Palestine as one of the biggest challenges you faced in engaging with others overseas. What do you make of this escalation?
Well, I think, first of all, it's an absolute humanitarian tragedy. And it's very unfortunate that this actually was allowed to happen and is taking place. Unfortunately, I think it indicates the ability of those on the extreme elements of the political spectrum, both in the Palestinian and Israeli political spheres, to bring things to happen to their advantage, which is to the disadvantage of the average Palestinian and the average Israeli, and really undermines efforts by moderates, by those who really want to resolve these issues, to come to political resolutions. So we have to figure out some way to disempower those who use these kinds of efforts to undermine efforts to actually resolve the underlying issues. And that is just unfortunate. And I think we as diplomats of the international community need to find a way to get the parties to move towards resolving the underlying issues and to disempower the extremists who use violence to prevent a resolution of those issues.
Right. And I also wanted to ask about the timing of this because, Israel, frankly, is in a political deadlock. It's had 4 elections in 2 years. And in the one most recently, a fortnight ago, it seemed like Netanyahu was on his way out. His time was up, but because his, mandate to form a coalition had expired. But, suddenly the escalation with Hamas made it completely politically infeasible for any opposition coalition to collaborate with more sort of left-leaning parties or Arab Israeli parties. And suddenly Netanyahu has a fighting chance to sort of continue his 12-year prime ministership. Is this escalation between Israel and Hamas, do you think this could at least in part be motivated by Netanyahu perhaps as his kind of last bid to stay in power?
Well, certainly, I think the fact that there was an effort underway to form a coalition which would have removed Netanyahu from power it's not coincidental that actions were taken in East Jerusalem specifically, and also activity at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which ultimately led to an eruption of violence. Unfortunately, at the same time, the marginalization of the Palestinians under the previous administration here in the U.S., I think also set a tone or set the possibility for the greater empowerment of the extremists, in this case, Hamas on the Palestinian side. So I think the immediate period right before the violence started was connected to the ongoing efforts to form a new coalition government in Israel. And then I think it found reciprocity on the more extreme side of the Palestinians because of the recent history of the treatment of Palestinians. So I think both sides, unfortunately, had motivations. The extremists on both sides had motivations to use this kind of activity to strengthen their own positions against the better interests of the moderates and those who want to see these issues resolved.
Interesting. And I also note that you're a member of the advisory board of the National Council for U.S. Arab Relations, and you talked a bit about how the previous administration might have an impact on, supposedly marginalizing Palestinians within America. Could you talk to me a bit more about that?
Well, unfortunately, after decades of essentially a uniform U.S. approach to the region, to the Arab-Israeli dispute, both under Republicans and Democrats, there were certain red lines, there were certain givens about how we approached the issue in order to try to position ourselves to be helpful towards resolving the issue. So we did not take unilateral steps to support one side or the other. It's true, I think many people will say, well, we were very supportive of many Israeli initiatives. Yes, but there were still also certain limitations to that support. And there was an effort by both Democratic and Republican administrations to get Israel to move towards resolving the dispute with the Palestinians and to reduce or limit Israeli actions, which we saw as unhelpful, such as settlement construction or annexation of territory. Unfortunately, in the previous administration, that all changed, and our policies completely supported all the unilateral activities that previous administrations had not supported. And as a result, I think the Palestinians really saw themselves as being marginalized, and as the U.S., the one party that might potentially play a role in bringing about a resolution of the conflict, as now being completely one sided. Now, that changed with the Biden administration, but the Biden administration is only a few months old. And so I think the festering unhappiness or even anger about the treatment of the Palestinians under the previous administration, and to some extent, the empowerment of more extremist views within Israel because of the policies of the previous administration, have now spilled over to what we're seeing as the violence. So I think the first step is to get the violence under control. And then I think the Biden administration has to make it very clear that it supports a resolution of the Palestinian Israeli dispute, as it said, in terms of a two-state solution with equitable outcomes for both sides. And I think if that message is received, I would hope the Israelis will respond by putting in place a moderate government that will proceed down that course. And the Palestinians, whose leadership is also having real problems, can also rally behind an effort to try to move towards a two-state solution. So I would hope the Biden administration, which has a very good team in place, can start down that path.
Hmm. That's really interesting. And another thing that sort of caught my eye about this event is, the kind of violence we're seeing between Israel and Hamas sort of matches the levels we might have seen in 2014. But I think one thing people might not be paying close enough attention to is the violence inside Israel, between, Jewish and Arab communities that until now have lived very closely side by side. And we haven't quite seen that fester in the way it is right now, at least for decades. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on that, on why sort of tensions inside Israel are sort of bubbling up with this conflict in particular, and this time in particular.
Well, I think that's very unfortunate because, as you said, I think there had been a history where Arabs inside Israel were willing to try to work within Israel towards their own sort of fair treatment, and also to try to be a voice for a moderate approach to the Palestinian issue, which would ultimately have resulted in a two-state solution with fair treatment of the Palestinians. I think recent developments, and frankly, here I would blame the U.S. to some extent, the policies of the previous administration, I think, really led to a certain extent to despair among all of those in the Arab communities within Israel and elsewhere, that there was going to be an effort to find an equitable resolution of the Palestinian issue. The Palestinians were not only ignored by the previous administration, they were completely marginalized in terms of having the diplomatic connections cut off, having aid cut off, and even to the extent where the plan was put out there that basically accepted Israeli annexation of significant parts of the West Bank. So when you start seeing policies like that, it leads to a level, it changes thinking, and well-intentioned people who might have thought that working within a political process, working towards what would generally be seen as a fair resolution of the issue, is now no longer viable. And if you get to that point, then unfortunately, certain elements, and this is certainly not all Arabs in Israel, but there will be elements within the Arab communities in Israel which will just despair of the prospect of a fair resolution for the Palestinians. And you begin to see this kind of activity, which really is extremely unfortunate because it undermines what could have been a unified approach within Israel towards a fair resolution of the Palestinian issue, which I still hope we will see once the current violence subsides.
Right. And speaking of the U.S. Role in all of this, I mean, I completely agree with you that the first step should obviously be the cessation of violence in Israel and Palestine. But the U.S. did use its veto in the Security Council to block three resolutions calling for a ceasefire, notably because it, didn't mention Hamas as contributing to some of the violence in the Middle East. And then it took Biden 8 days to call for a ceasefire himself. Um, and between all of this, lots of commentators and sort of lots of commentators have been saying Biden never came to power on a foreign policy agenda of prioritizing the Middle East. He's always been focused on China, China, and China. um, what do you sort of say to that? Do you think Biden's been too slow to act, and what role has that played so far?
Well, I guess the way I see it, first of all, Biden he has a very long career, a very long political career, and it's always been very supportive of Israeli security and Israeli well-being. But it is not supportive of the more extremist policies of the current government. Now, in terms of the UN, it's unfortunate that over the last couple of decades, I guess I would say, the perception, at least among Israelis of all stripes, is that the UN has lost its credibility or become a biased party vis-a-vis the Arab-Israeli dispute. Now, one can argue that, but under that circumstance, I think the Biden administration concluded that it would not be helpful to have Israel be the subject of a resolution at the UN, which it would not see as being a balanced resolution. It would kind of put Israel's back up and would just be counterproductive. That said, I think from the very beginning, if you look at the State Department statements that have come out, from the very beginning, they have actually reflected essentially the language that the UN resolutions have sought to have. So we've, as a sort of as a bilateral policy or as our own policy, have strongly supported a call for a ceasefire, et cetera, et cetera. So I think President Biden's kind of in the difficult position of he doesn't want to alienate the voices in Israel who could be helpful by doing things which will be perceived as being one-sided or biased. At the same time, he needs to get those voices on his side towards bringing about a ceasefire. Now, yesterday, for the first time after, 9 days, he did call for an immediate de-escalation. So that was a watershed development. And I think he will continue in that direction. So it's a tough balancing act because you don't want to alienate your potential partners on the Israeli side, but you do need to make sure you're making it clear that you really abhor the violence and you want to see it stop.
Mm. And when Biden uses the veto in the Security Council, I mean, frankly, that's not an anomaly. Almost all U.S. presidents have been doing that sort of consecutively for many years. But Biden came to power on an agenda of kind of building America back. And are you worried this might kind of undermine his position? Are you worried that the U.S. might lose space, or sort of we see decreased legitimacy of the U.S. as a sort of proper global international player when it's so blatantly kind of shielding Israel in multilateral diplomacy, even if it might be pursuing the right things and almost the same language in sort of bilateral relations?
Well, I mean, as I say, it's a difficult balance. I think Biden has made it clear and will continue to make it clear that America is once again out there in the international community promoting values that define the United States, that have defined the international order for the last 7 decades. That rule of law is important, human rights are important. Countries and individuals need to abide by certain kinds of rules. So I think that will continue to be an emphasis. Uh, the challenge right now is you have an ongoing conflict that you want to bring to a close. So you don't want to do anything in the immediate term, which will undermine that by signaling that you're, on one side or another, or you're blaming one side or another, or whatever. And so I think this immediate situation will need to be brought to an end. I don't think it will have an ultimate impact more broadly on Biden's message and the U.S. position that we will promote rule of law, human rights, fair treatment of populations, including the Palestinians and others, going forward. But right now, what we need to do is everything we can to stop the violence, and then we can get back to that broader message.
Mm-hmm. And I also want to get your thoughts on what levers Biden might have to influence any change in the future in the Arab-Israeli situation. Lots of people were enraged by the fact that he recently approved a $700 million arms sale to Israel, which is part of billions of dollars of arms sales happening, throughout his administration, dating back many years. Um, and frankly, when he was interviewed about this in 2019, he didn't possibly consider this as one of the things he would bargain with when considering, Israeli policy. Whereas on the other side of the political, I mean, on the same side of the Democratic Party, but on the sort of other end of it, Bernie Sanders has been advocating for using this as a bargaining chip with Israel, for withholding these arms sales until Israel can align more with the ceasefires that the United States proposed. What's your stance on that? Do you think the U.S. should be using its military sales to Israel as um, an instrument in maybe enforcing and bringing about peace?
Well, that's an interesting question, a difficult one. The timing is such, this was approved before the current violence took place. But yes, it does provide Israel with the kind of weaponry which allows it to undertake the precision targeting that it is taking. Then one could also make the case, well, would it be better for them not to have precision munitions, and therefore you'd have much more widespread violence? But I think the approach has to be to recognize, in other words, it can't focus really on the Israeli side. Israel, we will, the U.S., there's broad support for Israeli security. So within the U.S., there will continue to be very, very broad support for the idea that Israel should be provided with what it needs to defend itself and to maintain its security. That said, I think there needs to be a very overt and very forceful diplomatic effort of engagement with the Palestinians, with the Arab countries, to promote a settlement of the Palestinian issue, the dispute, the Arab-Israeli issue. And we need to bring to bear all of the factors. The Arab states can play a role here. We can play a role. Europe can play a role. To outline what would be a fair resolution of the dispute, and to use all of our diplomatic efforts and potentially other efforts, public opinion, et cetera, to try to move towards that kind of resolution. I think one of the positive outcomes of this otherwise completely tragic situation is a broader international recognition of the plight of the Palestinians, and therefore potentially coming out of this would be international support for really moving towards a resolution of that issue, which might even be something that happens in Israel, given what we've seen with the domestic developments in Israel. So possibly with strong diplomacy and strong international support, we could see a process come out of this which might actually lead to a betterment in the situation vis-a-vis the Palestinians.
And a central theme I kind of see throughout this discussion of ours is, just, the sort of bipartisan, staunch domestic support in the United States, all the way from the top for Israeli defense and security policy. But I'd be one to argue that, maybe that's not reciprocated to the same degree when we, think about Israel and its priorities towards the United States. One example of that, sort of oft quoted nowadays, is on the one hand, and Biden's diplomats are in Vienna. They're negotiating with the Iranians to bring back the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iranian nuclear deal, ostensibly to make the Middle East a safer place. And right as that's kind of happening, and they're having these talks indirectly with the Europeans, Israel sort of thwarting that entire process and covertly bombing Iranian sort of nuclear sites. Uh, you know, in what one can only assume to be their objective to be to kind of flare hostilities between the two sides, because Netanyahu is well known to be a critic of the nuclear deal. Does it seem like to you that the U.S. might not be getting enough back in its relationship with Israel?
Well, as I say, I think what we see here in the U.S. Is broad support for Israel, for its existence, for its security, but broad criticism of current Israeli policies. So yeah, on the extreme right wing, there's lockstep support for whatever Israel does. But more broadly, within the U.S., there's been a very significant erosion of support for the policies of the Israeli government. So I think we need to maintain that distinction. As you suggested, yes, it's clear Netanyahu has made it clear from the very beginning, from before the deal was even reached, that he's opposed to the Iran nuclear deal. But I think President Obama at that time and President Biden at this time both recognize the importance of addressing what would be the existential threat of Iran possessing a nuclear weapon. And the way to address that is through the nuclear deal. So I think we are, despite whatever opposition Israel or others might have, for U.S. security and for global security, I think the Biden administration will continue to prioritize making sure that Iran does not develop a nuclear weapon. And they will continue to do that through the nuclear deal. So I'm optimistic that ultimately that deal will come back into effect, and that will be the means by which we prevent Iran from pursuing a nuclear weapon.
Right. And sort of furthering discussion of these talks happening in Vienna, I mean, one thing that I just, found is a bit fascinating, and our listeners might find this interesting, is Iran doesn't want to be seen as negotiating directly with the United States. So all these diplomats are in Vienna, but it's a really funny logistical situation because the Americans are in one hotel, and the Europeans and the Iranians and the Chinese are in one hotel, and then the Europeans are shuttling back and forth between these hotels to kind of get the U.S. and the Iran to agree on, just something. And then these talks have been going on for weeks. Even some of these diplomats within it have expressed frustration privately to newspapers. And these talks, they seem to be stalling because Iran wants the U.S. to remove all of Trump's imposed sanctions. And the State Department deemed that to be a very unrealistic demand. And I find it really interesting because you've said in the past that the efficacy of these sanctions in Iran is very limited because most of the damage, especially in a country like Iran, is inflicted on the Iranian people, who instead we might rather look at as American allies. Uh, in your estimation, why is it that the State Department is so adamant on refusing to repeal Trump sanctions when it seems like to be the only thing blocking a potential security solution between Iran and the United States? And what do you think the U.S. should do instead?
Well, first of all, let me just say that the pressure of the policy of the previous administration of maximum pressure did not succeed. So we've seen that effort and we've seen that fail. So there has to be a different approach. Now, I think what we're seeing in Vienna is diplomacy at work. That is, you're going to see Iran make what you might call maximalist demands. They're going to ask for maximalist concessions. In this case, the lifting of all sanctions. Now, it's important to note that the nuclear deal never involved the lifting of all sanctions. It involved the lifting of certain sanctions that were associated with trying to counter Iran's nuclear program. There have always been other individual sanctions against specific people or organizations that are accused of or are seen as promoting international terrorism. So the sanctions associated with countering efforts to support international terrorism will not go away. They never did go away. But the sanctions that specifically were put in place to get Iran to address the Iran nuclear program, they're the ones that can be negotiated. So I think what we'll see is Iran will continue to posture in requesting all sanctions be lifted. I think the Biden administration will be willing to lift those associated with Iran's that were put in place to counter Iran's nuclear program, and that ultimately, I think that's the process that will lead us back into the deal once again coming into effect.
Hmm. And taking sort of a macro vantage view, I mean, the US appears to be sort of gradually disengaging from other regions in the Middle East, especially under President Biden. They've withdrawn support for the war in Yemen. They've ended sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia, or actually, I mean, at least temporarily frozen sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia, and they've planned to remove troops from Afghanistan. Do you think Biden and future administrations are going to keep moving forward in this direction of sort of disengagement from the Middle East, and or at least not direct engagement in the Middle East? And if so, I mean, what obstacles might stand in their way?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to note that the Middle East continues to be an area of very important strategic interest to the United States and the global community, both because of the role it plays in the global energy markets, but also because of the potential that violence there can spill over. You know, it's famously said, what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. And we saw that on 9/11. We've seen that repeatedly. So we will have to keep our eye on the ball in the Middle East. That said, I think the approach will be much less interventionist. We will, I believe, continue to keep a certain amount of military force in the region or over the horizon, as they say, as a means of deterrence and as a means of quick reaction if necessary. But I think we will seek to be less directly involved in the immediate day-to-day activities, in the immediate conflicts that are taking place there. So we will need to make sure that our fundamental interests continue to be assured in the region through some kind of military and security arrangements, including deployments. But I think we will seek to do that at the minimum level that we can to guarantee our interests. And so that said, I think we're looking to our partners in the region to, first of all, try to resolve some of the conflicts that are already there. You look at things like the Yemen war, Syria, obviously. I think it's very encouraging to see that Iraq, which would have a lot to gain if Saudi Arabia and Iran stopped being so antagonistic, is trying to do things to help reduce the antagonism between those two countries. We're making an effort. I think Oman is trying to help in addressing the civil war in Yemen. So I think we want to see our partners in the region work together to try to defuse the conflicts that are there, even as we will maintain the necessary capabilities to ensure that our interests and the interests of the global community, which are centered in the Middle East, continue to be supported.
Right, and like you alluded, I mean, Saudi Arabia and Iran have been holding these talks hosted by Iraq, which seems to be ushering in quite a significant realignment in the Middle East, I'd say, because animosity between these two countries has, long defined the sort of hostility in the Middle East. It's manifested in a number of proxy wars, notably the one in Yemen. Um, and it also is just happening really quickly. Just 3 years ago, MBS compared the Iranian leader, and he said something like, the Ayatollah Khamenei makes Hitler look good. And 3 years later, we're seeing these two gentlemen having their diplomats talk to each other in Iraq. So, did this take you by surprise, Ambassador?
Well, I guess I didn't specifically expect it to happen, but I do think we're seeing a recognition. Certainly, we've seen it already on the part of the Saudis. And I think maybe there's a chance of seeing it on the part of the Iranians. and that is the promotion over recent decades of what I would describe as extremist Islamic ideologies on both sides have undermined the security and the well-being of the region. And so I think the first, at least public statement of recognition of that was what we heard from Mohammed bin Salman a few years ago, and that is that he was indicating that he felt that Saudi Arabia had made a mistake in promoting what is seen as a relatively extremist version of Islam in response to what happened with the Iranian Revolution. So it seems to be that with the Iranian Revolution and Iran beginning to promote an extremist Shia-based Islamic ideology, the Saudis felt the need to kind of do the opposite, that is, to promote a more or less extremist version of a Sunni-based Islamic ideology. And now Saudi Arabia has stood down from that. And so I think that opens the door for Iran to consider, okay, this is not the confrontation that we were having before. And so therefore, maybe we can have a dialogue to figure out how to defuse what had been an ongoing confrontation for several decades and get back to both sides pursuing more moderate kind of political programs, which would do a great deal of good for the region as a whole.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think each side is trying to get out of these talks as sort of their objectives, and why is Iraq so intent on being the broker between these two sides?
Well, I guess I'll answer the second question first. Having served in Iraq and having been the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iraq, I'm very familiar with the difficult situation Iraq is in vis-a-vis Iran on the one side and its Gulf Arab neighbors on the other. Iraq is a majority Shia country, but it is definitely an Arab country. And so it's got in common with Iran a Shia majority, but in common with its Arab neighbors, an Arab population. And so it's sort of caught in between. Now, what Iraq wants most of all is to be left alone in the sense of not have outside countries try to influence its internal political developments. That unfortunately has not been the case. There's been tremendous meddling by Iran in in Iraq. Not so much on the other side. The Arabs have largely, unfortunately, in my view, kind of isolated Iraq. And I think what Iraq would like to see is Iran reduce its meddling and Iraq be able to take a position independent and work with both sides. So Iraq has a lot to gain by Saudi Iranian rapprochement. I think what the Saudis would like to see is you now have a region all around Saudi Arabia where Iran has influence through proxies. So you see it in Iraq, you see it in Lebanon, you see it in Yemen, you see it in Syria. And so Saudi Arabia would like to see a reduction in that Iranian influence through proxies. So I think their point of view is if they can have a dialogue with Iran and convey to Iran that they, Saudi Arabia, are not inimically opposed to Iran, that they would like to live in peace in the region with Iran, that potentially Iran would see that they don't need to continue expending the tremendous amount of financial and political resources that they expend in support of these proxies around the region. So that potentially, to me, would be the benefit to Saudi Arabia, and would certainly be a benefit to the region to see the end of these kinds of proxy conflicts all around the region.
Mm-hmm. And there's just a flurry of diplomatic activity in the Middle East, but another one of these potential reopenings might be between Saudi Arabia and Syria. And I'm wondering what your thoughts were in why that's happening, firstly, but also secondly, in what way that might either help or hurt the sort of more reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Well, I mean, I think that's going to be challenging because right now Well, first of all, Syria is a completely broken country. There's nominal leadership of parts of the country. Parts of it are basically outside of government control. And then the support that the government there does have comes largely from Iran and to a certain extent, from Russia. So I think those are going to make it. Those facts are going to make it challenging to come to a resolution of the Syrian conflict. That said, I think there is a broad recognition that the tremendous suffering of the Syrian people, the tremendous outflows of refugees and the internally displaced persons, the humanitarian situation in Syria might lead the countries in the region, in this case, perhaps led by Saudi Arabia, to decide to at least accept a status quo in which you still have the Assad regime in power, but under a situation which allows for other voices, which allows for a reconstruction and a return of the Syrian refugees. In other words, it's not going to be ideal, but it won't be a conflict. And therefore, potentially, and I think even Assad would accept some means of ending the quote unquote conflict in exchange for some kind of a political resolution. Potentially, Iran would not want to see that happen, so that potentially Iran could be a spoiler. But if Iran can be convinced through its discussions with Saudi Arabia or otherwise that it can live in the region in coexistence with the Arab states, they might also come to the conclusion that it's best that Syria return to some sense of normalcy and that the conflict there be brought to an end.
Mm-hmm. And I also want to move to sort of talking about your experience being an ambassador in Oman. It's a country that's often been portrayed as the Switzerland of the Middle East. Its foreign policy has been described as friends to all but enemy to none, and that approach involves quite opaque procedures as it becomes a sort of major negotiation intermediary in the Middle East. And I know that you saw firsthand when you were American ambassador the way sort of Oman played this kind of broker role, especially with Iran. And in your experience, I mean, how have the Omanis traditionally leveraged this influence in the Middle East?
Well, as you say, they have had a policy where they do seek to have good relations with all countries and, in particular, with all of their neighbors. And that has, of course, included Iran. There is actually a history there where Iran actually helped. Of course, this was under the Shah, but Iran actually helped Oman put down a rebellion in the Dhofar province with the support of Iranian troops. So there's a certain element even of gratitude for their relationship with Iran historically. Now, that's of course not with the current government; it's with the previous Iranian government. So, in general, they have sought to have good relations with all their neighbors, and in particular with Iran. Oman shares the Straits of Hormuz with Iran, and so they have to both work together to ensure that the Straits of Hormuz remain peaceful and shipping can go through, et cetera, et cetera. So they have very practical reasons for having those good relationships. On the other hand, Iran, I think, looks to Oman as being a credible, honest broker, quote unquote. Oman is a majority Ibadi country, and that's not known to a lot of people. The Ibadism sect of Islam is neither Sunni nor Shia. So, in that sense, Oman is seen as not being in either the Sunni or Shia camp. It's an Arab country, so certainly it's in the Arab camp. But as a result, I think there's a certain element of credibility that Iran sees with Oman. And one of the things I admire about Oman is they're very effective in their diplomacy. I remember when I was the ambassador there, one of the things we worked on successfully with Oman was gaining the release of 3 American hikers who had been taken in Iraq, actually, and then were in Tehran, imprisoned in Tehran. They were innocent American hikers who wandered over the border. But it was a very interesting object lesson in diplomacy because working with the Omanis, we, of course, didn't engage directly with the Iranians, but with the Omanis, they helped us and they helped Iran on both sides come up with some confidence building steps that gave both sides sort of the ability or the sense that we were willing to have a legitimate diplomatic discussion to resolve this issue. And ultimately, through those confidence building steps, we did resolve the issue, and Iran released the three hikers without preconditions, without a lot of posturing. That they understood that these were innocent people who just wandered over the border. As a result of the goodwill or the confidence that came out of that, that's what actually allowed the discussion for the nuclear deal to be launched, again, with the help of the Omanis. So it was a matter of gaining the goodwill or the confidence of the Iranians that the U.S. was willing to engage in diplomatic discussions without trying to make, big posturing or anything like that. And as a result, we sent a very good team of diplomats to Oman, and ultimately they were successful in arranging the deal. So I think it was a good case study in how relatively small diplomatic steps can be built on in order to reach what really, in my view, was a very important watershed success, which was the Iran nuclear deal.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to bring this back to the UK, which is where I'm recording this from. I mean, this year, particularly, after Brexit, everyone here has been trying to think about what role the UK should play in the world. The government has its own kind of global Britain agenda. The foreign policy review signals an Indo-Pacific shield. But one that caught my eye was in January of this year, Chatham House released a report saying that the UK shouldn't try to be, the world's sort of emulate some nebulous leadership role or try to be the world's police, but rather to try to be a quote unquote global broker. And that seems quite similar to what you're describing as the role that the Omanis played and continue to play in the Middle East. And I'm wondering, do you think there's any lessons that British diplomats can learn from Oman in sustaining sort of this delicate balance of allegiances?
Well, of course, Britain, more than Oman, is really solidly in the Western camp. I mean, Oman, yes, is a Western-oriented nation, but Britain, of course, is in NATO and is absolutely, kind of wedded to the Western alliance. But that said, Britain has a long history of global engagement and actually has a diverse population, which could play a role in continued engagement by the UK more broadly. Certainly, if I look at the Gulf, the UK has the ability, they have a long relationship with Oman and other states there in the Gulf. They have a lot of goodwill on the basis of the countries of the Gulf towards the UK. So certainly there they could play a very helpful role in trying to resolve some of the conflicts that are taking place there. And then more broadly, of course, the UK has the history of the Commonwealth. And so there are other disputes, there are other areas of conflict. You look at India, Pakistan, you look at Hong Kong, you look at places where the UK has historically had connections and I'm sure still has a certain element of viability vis-a-vis those kinds of areas. There are people in the UK with backgrounds associated with those areas who could also play a role. So I think the UK is a country that wants to play a positive role in promoting the kind of global values, the kind of global peace and security and rule of law that the West has been promoting for several decades now. And I think it's uniquely positioned, given its history and its global engagement, to be able to do that in countries in various parts of the world. So, yes, when I was in Oman, I got to know my British counterparts very well. I came to have great respect for the ability of British diplomats. And I think that ability, those capabilities, could and should be used to try to help address conflicts or tensions wherever they may be in the world, where the UK has history, where it has experience, where it has expertise.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, we've spoken about so many worrying trends today, and bloody conflicts, proxy wars, all sorts of things. But to end on a more hopeful note, given your extensive career in foreign service, in particularly in the Middle East, I want to know what makes you optimistic about the future of this region.
Well, I think generally it's a region, it's a very dynamic region. It's a region that is very young demographically. It's a region in which the young people there are very savvy, they're very connected. The social media networks in the Middle East, I think, are stronger than anywhere else in the world. And so the people there are knowledgeable, they're energetic. I think they understand the challenges that they're facing, and I think we're looking at really generational shifts based on the young people who are, coming into the adulthood there, the experiences they're having, their awareness of their own histories, their current circumstances, global trends. They're well educated. Many of them, hundreds of thousands of them, have been educated in the United States, in the UK, and elsewhere abroad. So I think there's a nucleus of great strength in terms of going forward, in terms of awareness and abilities on the part of young people in the region to address their current challenges and to make a positive contribution more broadly. So I guess in that sense, they've been through some very difficult times. They continue to have some very serious challenges. But I think that awareness and that experience is going to stand them in good stead as this next generation takes over and begins to really address some of the fundamental issues that their societies and their region face.
That's very promising indeed. Brilliant. That was a really fascinating conversation, Ambassador, certainly leaving me with a lot to think about. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and it's been my pleasure.
To find out more about London Politica, visit our website, londonpolitica.com, and follow us on LinkedIn. And that's all for this episode, folks. Stay tuned, stay safe, and I'll see you next week.